So you decided to get a new camera and up your YouTube game, but you have no idea what all these buttons do and what all these little settings are. You stopped by the right place. I'm Reggie and thanks for tuning to the channel. Today, we're going to be going over some basic camera settings to record video. So set your camera into manual mode and let's get into it. Alright guys, so 3 important settings on your camera you gotta know before you press the record button, and that's 1, the shutter speed, 2, your aperture, and 3, the ISO. All of them really deal with how much light you let into your camera sensor, and all of them have some kind of secondary effects on how you record your footage, so let's get into each of them. So your shutter speed is the amount of time your shutter is open letting in light to your sensor. A really slow shutter speed lets in a lot of light and makes your pictures brighter, while a fast shutter speed lets in less light and makes your pictures darker. The secondary effect is how much motion blur is introduced to your video. So fast shutter speed freezes the action and reduces motion blur, and a slow shutter speed creates a lot of motion blur. So for recording video, there's only one setting that you have to remember, and that is double the frame rate of what you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, which I definitely recommend, you're gonna double your frame rate and then set your shutter speed to 1/48. So that's 24 times 2 is 48. That rounds out to 1/50th. Just keep that rule in mind. That's the 180-degree rule, and that has to do with like shutter angles and stuff. And I don't really know the exact science of it, and that's really the rule to follow. So make sure that whatever your frame rate is, if it's 24, use 1/50th, 30 frames per second, use 1/60th, and if it's 60 frames per second, use 1/25th. Your shutter speed is really kind of set in stone. Just keep in mind, whatever your frame rate is, double it, and then that's what your shutter speed should be. Okay, so next up is the aperture, or the f-stop number, and this is basically just a measurement of how wide the opening in your lens is. It's a ratio, and it's kind of a weird thing to remember. So the bigger number you have, the narrower your opening in your lens is, and the smaller the number you have, the wider your aperture is. So basically, you know, f1.8 would be a really wide aperture, and then f22 would be a super narrow aperture. And again, what we're trying to do is control how much light is coming into the sensor. So wider is brighter and narrower is darker. And the secondary effect for aperture is basically what you control your depth of field and how much background blur is. That's also called bokeh. This is really where you can get creative. If you want to have a lot of background blur, then you want to have your aperture as wide as possible, as wide as your lens can go. Really wide ones are like f1.8 or f1.4, and then, you know, you'll get a lot of background blur or bokeh. And if you don't want that much, then, you know, you just crank up your aperture, and then it'll narrow the opening in your lens, giving you more of a clearer background. So this is where you can kind of get creative and figure out how much background blur you want. So again, the narrower your aperture is, the more in focus your background is. So think of it of like, you know, when you're squinting your eyes, you're like, oh, I need to like see something and I can't really see. It's a little bit blurry, so you squint your eyes and you can see it a lot more clearly. That's kind of the same thing with how a camera works. So you kind of do your like eagle eyes and you kind of focus in, then everything is like, you have a very deep depth of field, and then you can see a lot of stuff. So last but not least is the ISO, and that's how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So, and then the secondary effect is the clarity of your picture and how much noise is introduced. So if you have a higher ISO, your picture is going to be a lot brighter, but there's going to be a lot of noise. And if you have a low ISO, your picture is going to be darker. However, it's going to be nice and clean without any noise. So our job is to basically use the lowest ISO that we can possible and get like the most crisp footage that we can. And so, you know, what you're going to do is you're going to set your shutter speed, which is kind of locked in place. Then you're going to set your aperture, which you control how much depth of field you want. And then based on that, you adjust your ISO to see what kind of exposure level you want. So if you need it to be brighter, bring your ISO up, and if you want it to be darker, bring your ISO down. If you want it to be like really clean, make sure your ISO is super low. So what happens is if your picture is still too dark, then you got to introduce some light. You're limited by how much light you have. So if it's too dark still, then you need to be, you know, filming it outside or bringing in more studio lights or something. So that's the limitation. All right, fellow YouTubers, I hope this video was helpful. And now you should be able to keep your camera in manual mode and get some awesome footage. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more camera tip videos like this, please subscribe. I'm Reggie and I'm signing out. Thanks for tuning in to the channel, and peace.